Transition, the process of change from one condition to another.
We are now at a new crossroad where change is evident once again.
What does not serve us must transform us anew.
Returning to our original state of oneness and true nature of that which created who we truly are.
Confusion was the way of the past. Enlightenment is the way of the now and future, shedding away the layers of deceit.
We now bring you the transformation of the two who started as one. Our fearless planet never stands still.
Earth has been in a process of transition, and we are not exempt from this remarkable ongoing reality.
Welcome to Transition Radio.
Well, howdy and welcome. Welcome back to Transition Radio Show. I'm Mark.
And I'm Lynna. We wanted to thank you for joining us tonight as we explore an issue that, I don't know, a lot of people just don't really understand, that certain terminologies didn't really exist. And the basis of our show is called, the invention of the illegal alien.
And what most people don't understand, and I think as many of us, our eyes are opening to the reality of things, from the fairy tale lies they've told you about the God that you believe is the God of this world, which is not. There's just so many things that are coming to light. We are living in times of awareness, awakening. Some people are just refusing, though. They're going to go kicking and screaming.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
For their world, they don't want it to implode on them.
No.
So if they come to the realization that what they were taught or what they teach is not true.
Mm-hmm.
I remember this one pastor that we've been having a conversation with on Facebook. We went to his church.
Mm-hmm.
He was very compassionate and empathetic. We sat with his wife at a local restaurant for breakfast, and we ended up going to his church, visiting several times.
Yeah.
And one particular message that he was delivering was about, this story of David and his wife.
Wives,
yeah.
plural.
But then he was reading, and he caught himself reading about two wives that were being kidnapped and how he went to go rescue them. And it was like, whoa, we won't talk about that, because that is taboo, two wives. So let's just move on.
And that's the thing, they don't realize that a lot of what they're teaching wasn't meant for these times, and they believe that the God of the Bible is the same God in the Old Testament and New Testament. And they believe that Jesus came to die for our sin. It's like, no, folks, Jesus came to warn us about the God in the Bible. And we've had shows about it, clearly points out that Yahweh is the father of lies. He's a murderer. He was a murderer from the very start. I mean, he was telling the Pharisees of the time. He also hinted that what father would give snakes when their children's asking for fish or food or bread? Yahweh does all that.
Yeah.
He's not a nice guy at all. He's not even, there are things in the Bible you read that it's like, is this a God? Because it's like,
automatically, the God of the Bible, that Old Testament Bible, he disqualifies himself from being anywhere near the capability of being described as a
loving
God,
or a loving father.
What God would put a lying spirit into another king just so that he can manipulate him,
or harden the heart
of a Pharaoh?
Or
repent that he ever created man in the first place.
But the mentality of a lot of these followers of Christ, and they're not even following Christ, they're following Paul's teachings and following Yahweh. They don't understand that that's not how a God is supposed to be. They're like, you're trying to create God in your own image. It's like, no. You're trying to create God in your image.
They shouldn't really call themselves Christians. They should call themselves Paulicians or something, because what they believe in And what they quote mostly
is Paul.
is Paul.
They don't even quote anything that Jesus says, because the majority of stuff that Jesus wrote didn't even make it to the Bible, or
No.
Jesus said didn't make it to the Bible. Paul hijacked the religion.
I mean, he did. He's like, oh yeah, no, yeah, I heard that's what they taught, but this is what you really should do. Oh no, you don't need to circumcise yourself. And the Jews are like, what?
What?
We've been circumcising ourselves
Yeah.
since Abraham was given the directive to. And, I mean, so you've got like, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, Jesus teaching, but they're saying that we should be submissive to the governments, even if they're corrupt.
And that's not at all what Jesus said.
Jesus was a rebel.
Yeah, total rebel.
He was a subversive. He flipped tables over.
Yeah.
Because he saw injustice.
Yeah.
And there is no way that he would stand for injustice.
He would be like so upset
He would
of
be a
what
nice
they're
protester
doing
right
now. Exactly, to the immigrants, to the people that are the actual owners of this land, the people that actually lived here way before the Europeans decided to migrate over here.
And then inventing the story that every native population was a warring savage, that didn't know how to have real government, when the United States actually took its form of government from the Cherokee Nation. They stole their whole system of governance.
They made it sound like they were like savages, when the savages were the Europeans who
They called them savages.
They didn't even know how to clean themselves. They had the feces all over the place. I mean, it's like the indigenous people bathe daily, not the Europeans. I mean, it's like, come on, guys, get it right, learn true history, and stop being so racist.
And we're not trying to be anti-America on this channel, but what we are trying to say is that United States, you have never lived up to your ideals. You preach a certain ideal of liberty, justice, freedom, the rights for all, the respect for everyone, and freedom of religion, and, the rights to peaceful assembly, the rights to bear arms if you wanted to. I mean, this is nothing that the United States has ever been able to live up to. Maybe someday it can, but right now it can't.
It was an experiment, like one of the videos that I put up, and people just don't have a clue. They really don't.
And this eye-opening episode is going to shed light on certain things that you guys really have never even understood. We're finding out stuff, about 1924. You could cross the border, and it was not there was no, it wasn't regulated.
Exactly.
Nobody was checking your ID.
Last I checked, this is planet Earth. We're humans born on a planet that we should be able to come and go as we please.
Just like an animal has the right to cross the border.
Yeah.
Humans should have the right to go wherever they feel like on this planet.
Yeah. And, certain people don't have the rights to govern over other people. But, I'm going to learn the hard way. Karma is an SOB. Anyway, we like to tell ourselves that the United States is a nation of immigrants. And it's a comforting phrase that suggests the history of open arms, of Emma Lazarus, lamp lifted, besides a golden door. But the legal reality of American immigration has rarely been about the open door. It has been about the lock, and more specifically, about who holds the key and who designed the lock in the first place. Tonight, we're going to examine not just the machinery of exclusion, but the minds that built it, the pseudoscience that justified it, and the ongoing consequences that define immigration enforcement to this day.
We're looking at how the United States moved from a country with functionally open borders to a nation that now spends nearly $30 billion or more now a year on immigration enforcement alone. We're going to trace the invention of a legal category that did not exist before 1924, the concept of the quote-unquote illegal alien. And we are going to ask a series of difficult questions that go to the heart of what this country believes about human worth, about citizenship, about Who deserves protection under the law and who can be stripped of it?
If you think about the word itself, illegal alien, that is so demeaning.
It is. It's like
othering. Undocumented person because they don't have the proper quote unquote documents. But illegal aliens, that is as racist and demeaning as it could be. Is the system broken or is it doing exactly what it was designed to do? Who designed it? And what did they believe about human worth, about racial hierarchy, about the genetic fitness of entire populations? And finally, are the practices we see today. Practices involving coercion, deception, and the deliberate removal of legal protections. Practices that meet the legal definition of human trafficking under both U.S. and international law.
These are not, hold on a second, sorry. Updates. Okay. These are not abstract questions. They are questions with bodies attached to them. 120,000 Japanese Americans in prison behind barbed wire. 60,000 Americans forcibly sterilized. 230,000 people deported in a single year. Children separated from parents and told they'll only be reunited if legal rights are signed away. The architecture of exclusion has a human cost, and tonight we're going to count it.
Yeah, it's crazy. So, to understand where we are today, with detention centers holding over 100,000 people, with deportation flights to foreign prisons, with families separated by bureaucratic procedures, with U.S. citizen children being told they will be deported, we have to go back to a time when the federal government didn't really regulate immigration at all. For the first century of this country's existence, from 1776 to 1875, if you could get here, you were essentially here. There were no visas, no green cards, no border checkpoints, no illegal immigrations or immigrants, because there was no law making a human being illegal. Immigration, yeah, there was no law making a human being illegal. I mean, that's like, well, how can you be illegal? You're a human, for crying out loud. Immigration was a state and local matter, not a federal one. And the prevailing attitude was that the country needed people to settle the land, to work the farms, to build the infrastructure of expanding nation. It's almost like a slap in the face because they used all these immigrants to build this country. We, the immigrants, are the ones that build this country, okay? So now that you're all built, you're like, we don't want you here anymore because you're evil immigrants. Like that certain pastor showed us a picture of 8 or 9 victims of evil, illegal aliens that hurt, killed, or did something to those people. And I turned around and said, well, there was like 8,000 to 9,000 white people involved in murdering other white people.
Just look at your latest news and you'll see that very evident. You know, the demographics greatly favor white Americans as being the violent ones.
But yet 8 people were murdered.
Yeah.
8. Do you know how many thousands and thousands of people are murdered by white people?
And how many go unreported?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we were watching a documentary about buried bodies in an Arizona desert. Remember?
Yes.
I mean, it's just like, you know, the things that we don't know.
Hypocrisy, yeah. And it's just racism.
It is. So that changed when the people arriving started looking different.
Oh, yeah.
The shift begins not at the border with Mexico, but in the ports of California with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. They bring these people over from China to help build their railroads, supposedly. And then they get them built or cleared out, is what we're thinking, the tunnels and stuff.
Yeah.
And then they say, thank you.
Yeah.
Go back.
Go back. We don't want you anymore.
This is the moment the federal government steps in to say, not you. And it is critical to understand that this was not presented as temporary emergency legislation. It was presented as a permanent correction to what its supporters called the Mongolian problem, a supposed threat to white Christian civilization posed by Chinese laborers who were willing to work for lower wages and work together better than white people did.
And it's always the white Christians that have a problem, with the othering. It's like, oh, it wasn't just a pause on immigration. It was the first time the United States declared that a specific racial group was legally undesirable, that their presence degraded American society, that they were incapable of assimilation, and established the precedent that rights could be stripped based on ancestry alone, that being born in China was sufficient grounds for exclusion, regardless of individuals' character.
Okay. I don't know what happened here.
Individuals' character, skills, or intention. The law itself was explicit in its mechanics and its content. It suspended immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years, and it required any Chinese person already in the U.S. to obtain certificates proving their right to be here, effectively making every Chinese person a suspect until proven otherwise. And do you realize, even here in Silver City, they brought in tons of Chinese individuals, mistreated them.
Yeah.
And it's like, what is wrong with us? Why can't we face our demons and understand how harmful this country has been
and continues
to be?
The law imposed fines up to $500, an enormous sum in 1882, equivalent to more than $15,000 today, on any shipmaster who brought a Chinese laborer to American shores. And it authorized deportation. Any Chinese person found unlawfully in the United States was to be removed at the cost of the United States. That phrase matters because the government wasn't just closing the door. It was creating an enforcement apparatus to expel people who were already here, who had built lives, who had established businesses and families. The act also allowed vessel seizures and imposed criminal penalties on anyone who aided Chinese immigration, effectively enlisting private citizens in the project of racial exclusion.
Does that sound familiar? What's happening now? I mean, it's like there's nothing new under the sun. This has always been the heart and core of a lot of the Americans.
This is the heart.
Yeah.
The heart. And the heart is very, very poorly.
Yeah, it's dark.
I mean, it's
dark. It's a dark heart. And there's a lot of great white American people that are so supportive of all of us. Whether you're trans, whether you're gay, whether you're Hispanic, Black, Chinese, there's a lot of really good American people out there. But there's also a lot of really racist individuals that hold that racism deep within their core.
And the saddest part is those that are of, minority descent who literally betray their own people.
Stockholm Syndrome.
By supporting the empire.
Yeah, totally. To enforce that, you needed a bureaucracy. You needed inspectors with the authority to interrogate, detain, and reject. You needed interrogation rooms designed to break people, to catch them in inconsistencies, to manufacture grounds for exclusion. You needed detention facilities where people could be held indefinitely while their cases were processed, or more accurately, while they were worn down into accepting deportation. You needed to invent a way to filter humanity based on race to create procedures that appear neutral, but were designed to produce racial outcomes.
Enter Angel Island. Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco Bay opened in 1910 and operated until 1940, serving as the primary processing and detention center for immigrants arriving on the West Coast. It was called the Guardian of the Western Gate, a name that reveals its true function, not to welcome, but to guard against. Between 1910 and 1940, 175,000 Chinese immigrants were processed there, or more accurately, detained there under conditions that ranged from humiliating to cruel. The station was segregated by race and gender, with Chinese detainees held separately from Europeans in facilities that were deliberately inferior, with Chinese detainees often waiting weeks or months for processing, while Europeans passed through in days or even hours.
Nothing's changed. Nothing new under the sun. I mean, we're hearing about the conditions that many are facing right now in these detention centers. There's a video going around, these kids screaming. Kind of, they were dressed up. They had this thing about it looked like
Yeah,
the Squid Games,
yeah.
and it's like, what is going on here? Why are we so blind? Does that racism blind you so much that you can't see what is happening here? And the interrogations were designed not to verify identity, but to trap people to find any excuse to deny entry. The questions were absurdly specific, impossibly detailed. How many steps to the village well? Who lives in the third house in your row? What color was the door of your neighbor's home?
Mm.
How many windows face the street? What crops are planted in the field behind your house? And there's the same questions they ask, like people are getting married and somebody comes from elsewhere. They really try to trick you. Immigration, like I remember when I took my citizenship test, it was a horrifying test, and the way they treat you like you were less than. Describe the interior of the village temple. These weren't questions a son would necessarily know about his father's village if that father had left years earlier to work in America. And that was the point. The system was designed to fail people.
The interrogations were traps for paper sons, quote unquote, men claiming false lineage to merchants or citizens who could sponsor entry. Because Chinese laborers were excluded, but merchants were allowed, a whole secondary market emerged in false sponsorship papers, and the government knew this. And they designed interrogations to catch discrepancies. If your answers didn't match your alleged father's answers, even if the discrepancy was something as minor as a neighbor moving in after he left, or misremembering how many steps led to a well, you were denied entry and sent back across the Pacific after weeks or months of detention. Families spent years preparing for these interrogations, memorizing details, rehearsing answers, knowing that a single mistake could end everything.
This is the blueprint for modern immigration enforcement. The idea that the burden of proof is on the immigrant, that the government's role is to suspect and exclude rather than to welcome and integrate, it established the principle that minor inconsistencies in testimony justified exclusion, that the bureaucratic procedure can be weaponized to produce racial outcomes, that the government has the right to inspect, detain, and reject people based on their identity. It normalized the idea that some people deserve suspicion by default, that some people must prove they are not threats, that some people can be caged indefinitely while the state decides their fate. And it's still happening now.
And the Chinese Exclusion Act was not a one time law. It was renewed, expanded, and strengthened. In 1884, the law was amended to make it even harder for Chinese laborers to return to the U.S. after visiting China. In 1888, the Scott Act prohibited Chinese laborers who had left the U.S. from returning, even if they held valid reentry certificates, stranding thousands of people who had traveled home to visit family. In 1892, the Geary Act extended exclusion for another 10 years and required all Chinese residents to carry certificates of residence at all times, essentially creating an internal passport system for one racial group. The act made exclusion permanent in 1904, and it remained in force until 1943.
I'm thinking that Trump has been picking on different groups, Somalians, Haitians, they're eating cats and dogs, and now it's the Armenians. And then, he's just constantly in the trans people. Constantly picking. It's like no different than what was done before. We were starting to get a little better. We were making improvement, and poof, backwards again. 61 years. For 61 years, Chinese immigration was banned based solely on race. But the target didn't stay on the Chinese. The logic of exclusion, once established, could be applied to anyone. By the early 20th century, the anxiety shifted to Europe, specifically Southern and Eastern Europe, Italian, Jews, Poles, Greeks, Russians. And this is where we need to talk about eugenics, because eugenics provided the scientific justification for expanding exclusion from one racial group to many.
The American eugenics movement was not a fringe conspiracy. It was mainstream science, respectable, well-funded, institutionally supported. It was taught at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford. It was funded by the Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Harriman family fortune. It was endorsed by the Supreme Court of the United States. Eugenics was the belief that human worth is hereditary, that intelligence, morality, criminality, even poverty and alcoholism are passed down genetically, and that society could be improved, purified, by controlling who reproduces, by preventing the unfit from having children, and by preventing the unfit from immigrating.
The leading figures of this movement were not marginal cranks. They were respected academics with professorships, research grants, access to the highest level of government, and the credibility that came with institutional backing. And they had a very specific target: immigration. They believed that the United States was being flooded with genetic defectives, with people whose racial stock was inferior, whose presence would dilute and degrade the American gene pool. Three names you need to know: Charles Davenport, Harry Laughlin, Madison Grant. These men shaped American immigration law for generations, and their ideas killed people.
Charles Davenport was a Harvard trained biologist who in 1910 established the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, with funding from the Carnegie Institution and the widow of railroad magnate E. H. Harriman. This became the center of the American eugenics movement. It produced research, published journals, trained field workers to collect family pedigrees documenting alleged hereditary defects, and lobbied Congress to restrict immigration and permit forced sterilization. The majority of the Eugenics Record Office's resources were focused on two campaigns: restriction of the immigration of the quote unquote unfit into the United States, and forced sterilization of quote unquote degenerates who were already American citizens. Both campaigns were extraordinarily successful.
That makes you think. What makes us believe that that won't happen again?
Yeah.
That many of us who've come from elsewhere, who are naturalized citizens, that if you're trans, if you're gay, if you're Hispanic,
Well, they want to institutionalize the trans people.
Oh yeah. Well, Harry Laughlin was Davenport's protege and enforcer. In 1922, he was appointed expert eugenics agent to the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization. Let that title sit for a moment. Expert eugenics agent to a congressional committee tasked with writing immigration law. This was not informal advice. This was an official position with authority and credibility. Laughlin had no expertise in immigration policy, no training in economics or sociology. His expertise was in eugenics, in the belief that certain human beings were genetically inferior and needed to be excluded. Sound a little bit Hitlerish?
They're poisoning the blood of our nation,
Yeah,
Trump said last
yeah.
year.
Mhm.
Laughlin testified before Congress multiple times between 1920 and 1924, and his testimony was filled with charts, graphs, tables, all the trappings of scientific authority. He presented data, flawed data, as we'll discuss, purporting to show that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe had excessive rates of insanity, feeble-mindedness, criminality, epilepsy, tuberculosis, and dependency on public charity. He argued that most Jews were born feeble-minded, that Italians were genetically predisposed to crime and violence, that Slavs were incapable of self-governance, that the American gene pool was being polluted by a rising tide of defective immigrants who would outbreed native-born Americans and produce a degenerate future population.
Who's native-born American? Because last I checked, the only native-born American are indigenous people of this world, including the Mexicans, because they're indigenous too, But Laughlin's statistics were garbage. A colleague, bacterial geneticist Herbert Spencer Jennings of Johns Hopkins University publicly condemned Laughlin's methodology as invalid and his conclusion as unsupported by his own data. Laughlin had compared recent immigrants who were poor, who didn't speak English, who lacked family network, to more settled immigrant communities who had been in the country for decades. He failed to account for the fact that the older immigrant groups were more likely to care for disabled or mentally ill family members at home, while recent immigrants who may not have extended family in the country, who may not know how to access services, were more likely to place them in public institutions. In other words, Laughlin wasn't measuring genetic fitness, he was measuring social support networks, economic stability, and language barriers. He was measuring poverty and calling it genetics.
But Congress didn't care about methodological rigor. They cared about the conclusion, which justified what they already wanted to do anyway. The Eugenics Research Association displayed a chart beneath the rotunda of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., showing the alleged cost to taxpayers of supporting Laughlin's social inadequates, as he would say, putting a dollar figure on human beings deemed genetically defective. The resulting law was the Immigration Act of 1924, also called the Johnson-Reed Act, and it is arguably the most important immigration law in American history because it created the legal architecture we still live under today.
What's that saying? Give me your poor, your
battered and broken.
Come, that was like the motto.
Ellis Island.
Yes.
Liberty.
Liberty. And it's like, but as our leader in the White House makes fun of disabled people, makes fun of veterans, makes fun of anybody that is not the perfect human according to his eyes, beautiful, all this like things that he does. And it's like, we are all human beings. We all are entitled to love, equality, and life. It did several things, and each one was designed to produce racial outcomes while appearing facially neutral. First, it banned Asian immigration entirely, not just Chinese, but Japanese, Korean, Filipino, Indian, all immigration from what the law called the Asiatic barred zone. Second, it established strict national origin quotas. 2% of each nationality, 1890 census population. Why 1890? Because that was before the large influx of Southern and Eastern Europeans. The law was designed to explicitly to maintain a white Northern European majority, to freeze the racial composition of the country at a point before Jews, Italians, Greeks, and Slavs arrived in significant numbers.
Third, it created the United States Border Patrol, as we've talked about in previous episodes, as an enforcement agency. And fourth, and this is critical, it made crossing the border without authorization a crime for the what?
First time.
First time. Before 1924, America crossing the border from Mexico to California, Mexico to Nevada, to
Canada,
Arizona,
anywhere.
It wasn't illegal.
No.
It was unregulated. You could walk across at your desire, at your whim, just like any animal can. And you were here. After 1924, it was a criminal act, a misdemeanor for the first offense, and a felony for subsequent entries. The law invented the legal category of the quote unquote illegal alien, a term that dehumanizes, that treats human migration as a form of contamination, that makes a person's very existence a violation of law.
I mean, there's coyotes that I'm sure cross back and forth between Mexico. I'm sure there's different types of birds and things that migrate from one place to another. No one's checking their visa and anything like that.
Birds aren't stupid enough to set it up.
I know. They just like...
Coyotes wouldn't think of it.
I know. The quotas were devastating. Under the 1924 Act, total annual immigration was capped at 165,000 people, an 80% reduction from pre-World War I levels. Italy, which had sent hundreds of thousands of immigrants in the years before the war, was limited to fewer than 4,000 per year. Poland was limited to 6,000. Russia, fewer than 3,000. Greece, fewer than 100. These quotas remained in effect for 41 years, and they had catastrophic consequences during the Holocaust. when Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany were turned away because the quota for their country of origin were filled. The United States could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives by expanding the quota, but it chose not to.
Third figure we need to discuss is Madison Grant. Grant was a lawyer, a conservationist. He helped found the Bronx Zoo and save the California redwoods. Sounds like a nice guy.
Yeah.
And the author of a book called The Passing of the Great Race, published in 1916. You know, there was a guy that did atrocities in this world that were very fond of him. Adolf Hitler called it his Bible. And after the war, when Grant's role in inspiring Nazi racial ideology became clear, his reputation collapsed. But during the 1910s and 20s, he was celebrated. He was influential and connected to power. The book argued that the Nordic race, tall, blonde, blue-eyed Northern Europeans, well, they were superior to all others, and that immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe was diluting American racial stock with what Grant called social discards and weak refugees.
You know, it's really funny about all that. You see how people use tanning beds or they get a perm to make their hairs curly like people of color. You know, they're constantly like today
or they're taking over rap music.
Rap music. We were watching this little documentary about
the new
rednecks and they're sitting there rapping and I'm like, wait a minute, you don't like black people, but you're stealing their music. That's
pretty poor.
Yeah.
They steal anything. It's like there's no originality other than, I don't know.
That's all they've ever done is stolen things from. I mean, what actual food is American?
A hot dog.
No, that's German. Go on.
A hamburger.
Nope.
That's German?
Yeah.
A taco.
Nope, that's Mexican. They don't have anything. Pizza's Italian. I mean, they
a Cuban sandwich.
They hate immigrants. No.
That's American.
No.
Cuban sandwich.
They steal everything, and they don't like immigrants, but they like their food and they like their music.
Yeah.
You know? Grant was vice president of the Immigration Restriction League, an organization founded in 1894 by 3 Harvard graduates, Prescott Farnsworth Hall, Robert DeCourcy Ward, and Charles Warren. The League's stated goal was to prevent what they perceived as inferior races from diluting the superior American racial stock. What stock? I mean,
it's weaker.
It's weaker. Can you jump as high as a Black African American?
Yeah.
You know, look at your genetics.
Yeah.
Please. The League's founders were Boston Brahmins, old stock Yankees with family money and Ivy League degrees. Henry Cabot Lodge, the powerful Massachusetts senator, was a member and helped draft the League's legislative proposals. Joseph Lee, a wealthy banker and twice elected Harvard overseer, was a major funder, contributing thousands of dollars to lobbying campaigns. This wasn't a fringe movement. No, this was the establishment, the people who ran universities and banks and sat in the Senate. Nothing's changed.
No,
we still have
as we see Congress today, and
God.
all the senators that chose to speak were like older than.
It's like they need a new law.
They do.
If you are above 50, you cannot run for Congress. You cannot run for president. We need young blood in politics. It's decrepit old people.
People that can't even remember.
They can't even stand up barely.
I know.
It's like, no. We need young blood in politics.
One of them was saying that Freddie was holding a radio.
I know. It's like
people don't even know what a radio is.
That was a cell phone.
It was a cell phone. Grant helped draft the Immigration Act of 1924. As vice president of the Immigration Restriction League, he argued that immigration quotas needed to be reduced even further to preserve Nordic dominance, and he lobbied Congress personally, testifying before committees and meeting privately with legislators. And it worked. The act significantly limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and when Jewish refugees, and this is sad, tried to flee Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, the quotas remained in place. Even after Pearl Harbor, ships full of refugees were turned away. The St. Louis carrying 937 Jewish refugees, was denied entry in 1939 and forced to return to Europe, where more than 250 of its passengers were later murdered in the Holocaust.
And all for what? Because they wanted to meet quotas, because they wanted to make sure that whitey remained the prominent race in America.
Not just whitey, Nordic whitey.
Nordic whitey.
Yeah.
You have to have them blue eyes, blonde hair,
Yeah.
you can't, yeah. I mean, that's beyond me. I don't understand how anyone could think that way. The United States Congress did not adjust the quotas to accommodate those refugees. The Immigration Act of 1924 was not overturned until the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. I was 1 year old. 41 years during which American immigration policy was explicitly eugenic, during which the law of the land declared that some races were inferior and unworthy of entry. 41 years during which the greatest humanitarian crisis in modern history unfolded, and the United States chose to keep the door closed. How great is America again?
Not so great. But the eugenics movement, well, it didn't stop at immigration restriction. It went even further. It also succeeded in its other campaign, forced sterilization. Buck versus Bell, and this is sad, 1927. Carrie Buck was a young woman committed to the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded after being raped by a relative of her foster family and becoming pregnant. The family had her committed to hide the assault, to remove the evidence of their relative's crime. The superintendent of the institution, Albert Sidney Pretty, wanted to sterilize her, but he was cautious. He wanted to test the constitutionality of Virginia's 1924 Eugenical Sterilization Act before performing the procedure. So he engineered a test case arranging for Carrie Buck to be represented by a lawyer who barely defended her, who colluded with the state to produce a ruling that would authorize mass sterilization.
So we're going to play one of your songs that you wrote regarding Renee Good. They thought we'd forget. I wanted to point out that I'm so thankful for those Americans that stand up for what is right. People that are in Minneapolis right now, in the coldest weather you could possibly think of. They're protesting, they're standing up, they're helping, bringing food to those undocumented individuals, or even documented, because they're too afraid to go out there thinking they're going to be racially profiled. If it weren't for these great individuals, I don't know what we would do right now.
My heart, part of it's always going to be in the state of Minnesota and the good people there.
Yes.
And it always welcomed me with open arms when I transitioned. It was home for me. And the people have always been very accepting and loving and non-judgmental and kind. And to see the state attacked like it has been, a good state, a state that has an education system that is always up there, that has a livability ratio, even though it's one of the coldest places to live, it's one of the most wonderful
warmest
places to have to call home.
And great governor. I mean,
yeah.
And
so it's sad because the corrupt states like Florida, like Texas, Louisiana, these states, they get the free pass. They have like, there's like 1.7 million undocumented in Texas, which we don't want them touched either. But Minnesota has like under 200,000.
It's a vendetta that Trump has with them. And, reading another quote that the pastor had said that Governor Walz is a liar unless he hands over the criminal, because they always have to have the word criminal, illegal aliens. I mean, it's pretty sad and pathetic, to tell you the truth. But anyway, they thought we'd forget, a byproduct of my beautiful wife, Lynna, and it's a beautiful song and great video as well.
We're taking back our country. This is our house. Stop the steal.
It didn't end when the windows broke. It didn't die held its breath, changed its name, and crossed state lines
to play the game. They called it riot, called it rage, then rewrote it on a cleaner page. Same flag, same fists, just tucked away. Now they knock in silence, broad daylight raids.
You didn't stop them, you gave them a badge, and now they strike from behind the glass.
They shot a woman through her car door. No warning, just the echo of war. Said we feared for our lives, like a script they know.
But fear doesn't bleed in the frozen snow. They thought we'd forget, but memory's flame burns hotter than the flags they claim. They thought we'd sleep, but truth won't rest. We carry it tight inside our chests.
I saw the footage, saw the van, ice in the street like a deathless brand. No questions asked, no time to speak.
Just boots and cuffs and blacked out fleets. And still you ask, what did she do? Wrong question, ask, what did they do to you? They thought we'd forget, but we wrote it down in shattered doors and frozen ground. They thought we'd break, but we walked through fire with justice pulsing like a wire.
They changed the rules,
But not the game,
they swapped the mask,
but kept the name.
they built it bold.
But we remember, from DC smoke to Minnesota's embers. They thought we'd forget, but we hold the line in every name. They tried to hide, and they thought we'd kneel, but we still rise with every truth they sterilize. The coup didn't stop, it rebranded.
The van was white,
The fear was standard.
but we are not confused.
We are wide awake. We are wide awake.
I want to take this time to ask you guys to please subscribe to the channel. If you're not subscribed, hit that notification button. And if you feel so compelled to support the channel, you can do so by either doing a one-time PayPal or reoccurring, or becoming a Patreon, or just downloading some of the music in Spotify or iTunes, wherever you get your digital music. We would highly appreciate it. A lot of work goes on to these shows, especially my dearie here. She does a lot of research and she puts all this stuff together. Yeah, but we do appreciate you. And if you can't support it, just watch, share, and like and subscribe and all that great stuff. So going back to the state produced a ruling that would authorize mass sterilization. I mean, let that sink in. Mass sterilization. Buck versus Bell reached the Supreme Court in April 1927. On May 2nd, 1927, the court ruled 8-1 that Carrie Buck could be legally sterilized. The majority opinion was written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., one of the most celebrated jurists in American history, and it was less than 3 pages long. Holmes wrote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offsprings for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, wow, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." What happened to no abortions? What happened to caring about children? It's selective, I guess. And then he wrote the phrase that would haunt American jurisprudence for decades. The phrase that revealed the cruelty at the heart of the ruling. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Let that sink in. That is the mentality.
That is the DNA of this country.
Oh, wow.
America, you have not lived up to your ideals. You never have. Remember this. You said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough.
And
for a woman who was not even dumb or anything like that. She was a person who was RAPED'd, and the family wanted to cover it up. What other things are they covering up? Trump.
Yeah.
The court accepted without evidence that Carrie Buck, her mother Emma, and her daughter Vivian were all feeble-minded, and they accepted without evidence that the trait was genetic, that it was passed from the mother to the daughter to the granddaughter. Later research showed that none of this was true. Carrie Buck was not intellectually disabled. She had been RAP'd, and her pregnancy was the reason for her commitment, not her intelligence. Her daughter Vivian was not feeble-minded either. She actually made the honor roll in school before dying of an intestinal illness at age 8.
Wow.
The supposed 3 generations of imbeciles were a lie, like everything else. A fabrication designed to create legal cover for mass sterilization.
Just like they lie about the indigenous people being savages, warring, and doing terrible things. So what, the great Americans came and saved their soul and made them Christians and made them better people, made them cut their hair, made them forget their culture?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, you can't help but be angry.
Yeah.
You can't.
And then for a Christian pastor to justify it is just, well, it's not too far from what we expect.
Yeah. But by then, the damage was done. Buck versus Bell established legal authority for sterilization more than 60,000 American citizens in more than 30 states. California alone sterilized 20,000 people, most of them poor women, immigrants, women of color, women in psychiatric institution or prisons. North Carolina sterilized more than 7,000. Virginia, over 8,000. Most of those sterilizations were performed without informed consent, sometimes without the victims even knowing what was being done to them. Women were told they were having appendectomies and woke up sterilized. Teenage girls were sterilized for being promiscuous. Poor women were sterilized for having too many children. What happened to the no abortions? I mean, it's like, I don't get it. Native American women were sterilized as part of Indian Health Service procedures. Most of those practices continued until the 1970s, and some states did not formally repeal their eugenics laws until the 21st century. It's crazy. And it's just so hypocritical. They say one thing on one breath and do something else in the other breath.
Justice Robert Jackson, who would later serve as chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, who would help define crimes against humanity, dissented in a different case, but warned that Buck versus Bell would lie about like a loaded weapon for future abuse, because he was right. The Nazis cited Buck versus Bell, that American ruling, to justify their own forced sterilization program, which sterilized 400,000 people. At the Nuremberg trials, Nazi doctors cited American eugenics laws in their defense, arguing that they were simply following the precedent set by the United States. The loaded weapon that America built was picked up by the Third Reich and turned into an instrument of genocide.
And Buck versus Bell has never been overturned. It remains on the books as president, a loaded weapon still lying there. And that's scary.
It's still there.
It's still there. And that's scary because if Trump
he
gets his bright ideas.
Just like his 1798 Act,
Oh, boy.
So by the 1920s and 30s, the machinery is in place. You have the concept of the quote-unquote illegal alien created by the 1924 Act. Of course, this is all just a created fabrication, not an actual thing. You have the Border Patrol as an enforcement agency, a racist organization. You have racial quotas justified by eugenics. You have forced sterilization sanctioned by the highest court in the land. You have a legal framework that treats some human beings as inherently inferior and threats to be managed rather than people to be welcomed. But then comes war. And in war, the undesirable immigrant becomes something much more dangerous in the public eye. Oh yes, the enemy alien, the spy, the terrorist, the saboteur, the fifth column waiting to strike from within as they did to the Muslim, Islamic person in 9/11.
Yeah, it's crazy. We see this in the World War I with German Americans. Thousands were arrested. Hundreds of German language newspapers were shut down. German music was banned from concert halls. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage, and Dachshunds were kicked in the street because they were German dogs. But the most devastating application of wartime exclusion comes in World War II. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt on February 1994. 1942, 10 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The order authorized military commanders to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded as a matter of military necessity. The text was race neutral. It didn't mention Japanese or any other group, but the application was not.
Executive Order 9066 was used exclusively to incarcerate Japanese Americans. 120,000 people, men, women, children, infants, the elderly, were forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast and imprisoned in remote camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. 2/3 of them were born in the United States, born on American soil with all the constitutional protections that citizenship is supposed to guarantee. Let that sink in. Citizenship did not save them. Being born on American soil did not save them. Serving in the U.S. military did not save them. Japanese heritage alone was grounds for imprisonment, for the suspension of habeas corpus, for the loss of property and liberty without trial.
Families were given days, sometimes hours, to pack 2 suitcases each and report to assembly centers, often former racetracks or fairgrounds where they were housed in horse stalls still reeking of manure. They lost their homes because they couldn't pay mortgages while imprisoned. They lost their businesses because they had to liquidate inventory at pennies on the dollars. They lost family heirlooms, photographs, wedding kimonos, everything they couldn't carry. The economic loss has been estimated at between $2 and $6 billion in today's currency. But the human loss, the psychological trauma, the broken lives, the destroyed futures cannot be calculated. Some Iseman's first-generation immigrants who had spent decades building lives in America committed suicide rather than face the shame and horror of incarceration. What makes us think that won't happen again?
It's set to do. They were sent to camps in remote, desolate areas, deliberately chosen to be inhospitable. Manzanar in the California desert, Minidoka in the Idaho sagebrush, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Poston and Gila River in the Arizona heat, and we're talking heat. Tule Lake in the California mountains, Topaz in the Utah desert, Rower and Jerome in the Arkansas swamps, Grenada in the Colorado plains, barbed wire fences, guard towers with searchlights, and machine guns, armed soldiers with orders to shoot anyone who tried to escape, tar paper barracks with gaps in the walls that let in snow and dust, communal latrines with no privacy, mess halls serving cheap, unfamiliar food, families crammed into single rooms. The camps were prisons in everything but name.
And the justification was military necessity. The claim was that Japanese Americans posed a security threat, that they might engage in espionage or sabotage, that their loyalty to the United States was suspect because of their racial heritage. But there was no evidence. No mass espionage plot was ever discovered. No sabotage campaign ever materialized. Not a single Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage or sabotage during World War II. The threat was entirely imagined, a product of racism and war hysteria. But it was treated as fact, and 120,000 people were imprisoned on the basis of that lie.
In fact, 33,000 Japanese Americans served in the United States military during World War II, many in segregated units like the 442 Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Infantry Battalion, which became the most decorated in American military history for their size and length of service. They fought in Italy, in France, in the Pacific. They earned 21 medals of honor, thousands of Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars, Silver Stars. They liberated concentration camps in Europe. They served while their families were imprisoned, while their parents were being held behind barbed wire by the very same government that they were fighting for. They served to prove their loyalty, but their loyalty should never have been questioned in the first place.
Fred Korematsu challenged the incarceration. He was a 23-year-old welder from Oakland who refused to report for removal and went into hiding. He was arrested, convicted of violating the exclusion order, and his case reached the Supreme Court in 1944. The court ruled 6-3 that the incarceration was constitutional. The military necessity justified the suspension of constitutional rights for an entire racial group. Justice Hugo Black, writing for the majority, acknowledged that racial discrimination is odious to a free people, but he argued that the pressing public necessity may sometimes justify the existence of such restrictions. In other words, yes, this is racial discrimination, but we're at war, so it's allowed, so the Constitution doesn't apply.
Justice Robert Jackson dissented, and his dissent was prophetic. He warned that the decision would lie about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need. He warned that the court was validating the principle that military commanders could suspend constitutional rights for entire groups of people based on race, and that this principle, once established, could be used again and again. He was right. In 1983, 40 years later, a federal judge vacated Fred Korematsu's conviction.
The judge, Marilyn Hall Patel, found that the government had suppressed evidence that military officials knew there was no security threat from Japanese Americans, that intelligence agency had reported that mass incarceration was unnecessary, but that those reports were hidden from the Supreme Court. The incarceration was motivated by, guess what, racism, not military necessity, by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The government had lied, no shocker there, and 120,000 people had been imprisoned because of that lie. Fred Korematsu's conviction was overturned, but the Supreme Court's decision in Korematsu's versus United States has never been formally overturned. It remains on the books as precedent, a loaded weapon still lying there waiting.
And it has been picked up. In the travel ban cases of 2017 and 2018, the Trump administration cited Korematsu as precedent for the president's authority to exclude entire nationalities based on national security concerns. In oral arguments, the government's lawyer explicitly relied on Korematsu. Chief Justice Roberts, in the majority opinion upholding the travel ban, wrote a single sentence stating that Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided, and it has no place in law under the Constitution. But he did not formally overturn it, and he upheld the travel ban using the same logic that presidential assertions of national security justify discriminatory exclusions. The loaded weapon was picked up and fired again.
After World War II, immigration law evolved slowly. The 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act abolished the national origins quotas, replacing them with a preference system based on family reunification and needed skills. The law was signed at the base of the Statue of Liberty by President Lyndon Johnson, who called the old quota system un-American in the highest sense, and said the new law would correct a cruel and enduring wrong. But the machinery of exclusion didn't disappear. It adapted. It evolved. It found new targets and new justifications, starting in the 1980s and accelerating dramatically after September 11th, 2001. A new phenomenon emerged that legal scholars called crimmigration.
It's an ugly word for an ugly phenomenon, a word that sounds like what it describes. Something hybrid and unnatural, something that doesn't fit existing categories. Crimmigration is the merger of criminal law and immigration law. The blurring of the line between these two systems, immigration violations, historically civil matters, administrative infractions comparable to traffic violations or permit violations, are now treated as criminal offenses, triggering detention, prosecution, deportation, and permanent bars to reentry. The term was coined by legal scholar Juliet Stumpf in 2006 in a law review article that described how criminal law has engulfed immigration law, how immigration enforcement has now been weaponized through criminalization.
For most of American history, being undocumented was not a crime. You were out of status, yes, you were subject to deportation, but you weren't a criminal. You weren't prosecuted. You weren't sent to prison. That distinction has collapsed. Now, improper entry is a federal misdemeanor, and illegal reentry after deportation is a federal felony carrying up to 20 years in prison. Now, local police collaborate with ICE through 287 agreement and secure communities programs to funnel people from local jails into federal deportation proceedings. Now, traffic stops become immigration enforcement, and a broken tailgate can end in deportation. And the scale of enforcement has exploded in ways that dwarf anything we've ever seen before. And I remember before I became a citizen, that was one of the reasons, because I think it was Reagan. One of them was the one that actually did that. And I was like, oh gosh, so like a traffic violation could get me deported back to Cuba, because I wasn't going to become a citizen.
Yeah.
I was very proud. I'm still very proud to be Cuban. But I felt like my hands were tied, so, but that's just, that's wrong.
In July 2025, Congress approved $29.9 billion for ICE enforcement operations. That's triple ICE's previous annual budget, a 300% increase in a single fiscal year. Congress also approved $45 billion for the construction of new detention centers, including family detention facilities designed to hold parents and children together. That's a 265% increase over the current detention budget. And they approved $46.6 billion for border wall construction, which is more than 3 times the total spending on the border wall during the entire first Trump administration. We're talking about spending in a single year that exceeds the combined totals of entire previous decades.
The total immigration enforcement budget now exceeds the entire federal prison system budget by 62%. Think about that. We are spending more on immigration enforcement, on catching, detaining, processing, and deporting people whose only violation may be crossing the border without authorization than we spend on imprisoning people convicted of federal crimes. including terrorism, drug trafficking, violent crimes, white-collar crimes. These funds could result in daily detention of at least 160,000 non-citizens. To put that in perspective, the entire Federal Bureau of Prisons houses approximately 150,000 people. We're building an immigration detention system almost as large as the federal prison system to hold people who are not criminals, who have not been convicted of crimes, who are being detained purely for civil immigration violation. They have found 9 deaths caused by evil and legal aliens, okay, and they're making such a to-do about it. But what's under all of this is racism.
And deportations have surged beyond anything in modern history. In 2024, ICE removed approximately 285,000 people. In 2025, that number rose to an estimated 310 to 315,000. But the nature of those removals has shifted dramatically, and that shift reveals the true purpose of the system. In fiscal year 2024, only 18% of ICE removals were from the interior of the country. The mass majority were people apprehended at or near the border and quickly processed for removal. By 2025, the ratio had reversed. Most reversals and removals were from the nation's interior, from communities, from homes, from workplaces.
That means ICE is no longer primarily focused on border security. They're going into communities where people have lived for years or decades, where they have jobs and family and roots. They're conducting workplace raids. They're stalking out courthouses and schools. They're knocking on doors at dawn. By October 2025, over 40,000 people had been arrested who had never been charged with any crime and for whom DHS had no removal orders. Let me repeat that because it's almost incomprehensible. 40,000 people arrested by immigration authorities, none of them charged with any crime, none of them subject to existing removal orders. They were arrested purely for being undocumented, purely for existing in the wrong legal status. Throughout 2025, 230,000 people were deported, and many of them have been in the United States for more than a decade.
The human cost is staggering. Families separated, children left behind, communities destroyed, businesses shuttered, crops rotting in fields because there's no one to harvest them. But the economic cost is equally staggering, and it reveals the absurdity of framing this as economic policy. The Wharton School of Business, which Trump says he graduated from, analyzed the fiscal impact of mass deportation, and their findings should terrify anyone who cares about fiscal responsibility. They found that removing unauthorized immigrants would decrease tax revenue by $187.4 billion over 10 years. Why? Because 44% of unauthorized immigrants file and pay income and payroll taxes using individual taxpayer identification numbers. They pay into Social Security and Medicare, even though they can never collect benefits. They pay property taxes, sales taxes, gas taxes. They are net contributors to the public coffers.
People don't realize how this is going to affect us economically in years to come. Because if you don't have that cheap labor, if you don't have people picking your vegetables, if you don't have people cutting your lawns or in construction that are undocumented and are getting paid less than...
Or making you good food.
Oh, yeah. And they're not getting paid as someone who's documented. What do you think is going to happen to your prices? It's going to go up. I mean, have you all thought about that? Because, I mean, I don't think Trump is very smart. And when it comes to economics, he's been bankrupt. I mean, the man doesn't know his right from his left. But you all are putting so much trust on this man and on the system that he's creating. And you're creating such karma that is horrifying. And on that note, I'm going to play a song that I wrote. It's called A Change Is Upon Us. I'm hoping that all this evil and all this stuff that is being produced will end up helping people wake up. Because that's the only way a lot of people wake up, is when they're forced. It's like a rude awakening. You think that you could call yourself a Christian and follow the teaching of Jesus, but you're actually following Yahweh, that genocidal warring God that did that throughout the Bible, genocidal acts through other tribes that weren't his people, or that they weren't worshiping him, so he slaughtered, and because you weren't following his commands, he was going to give you some horrible disease or give you poison quails and snakes. I mean, I don't know, people. We need to really start to think. Anyway, it's called A Change is Upon Us.
The change is upon us. We hold on to the past, try to create our future, but miss the message being given to us in the now.
The winter cold rips right through your bones, sending a chill down your spine. Let us leave all our anger behind, create a world filled with love and harmony. No more wars, it's time, you see, to evolve into the highest thing we can be.
Let us bring an end to this illusion. Shiny trinkets we collect, give it value and fail to respect what matters most. Our life, the breath we take in, and the love we carry in our heart.
Everything changes, snow becomes water, water becomes vapor. Can't you taste it? You're part of it, don't you waste it. It's a cycle, you wanna know the future. Look into the past, we continue the same patterns because we forget to live in the now. In fact, if we wanna grow and change things, we must let go of desires, wants and needs. Don't you realize we have everything within?
The circus around us keeps us on the Ferris wheel,
Going round and round and never ending here.
it's time to move on.
Look up to the stars
They have the message, the answers.
to help you connect with your higher self.
There is nothing else, it is you, it is yourself, and everything around you is a mirror image to help you grow. To find the answers that will let you know, but you continue to look outward, destroying everything in your path.
No more, the time has come. Either you get it or you won't survive.
The merry-go-round is about to stop. Take responsibility, stop blaming others for your actions, or waiting for someone to bail you out.
This is it,
There is no way out,
it is up
to you and no one else.
Let the system fail. Bring an end to this civilization and learn to be one with who you truly are, and not the ego that you have become. You are the light and the ones you have been waiting for.
It's quite the catchy tune.
Yeah.
And it started as a poem back in 2006, 2007, and I just made it into a song using Suno.
Good old Suno.
We don't get sponsors, but Suno is really cool little app that helps you really bring music to life. Anyway, the Wharton analysis found that primary deficits, the gap between spending and revenue before interest on debt, would increase by $217 billion over 10 years if mass deportation occurred. Factoring in dynamic economic effects, the ripple effects through the economy as demand falls and production declines, primary deficits would increase by $349.6 billion. Wages would fall for high-skilled workers because of reduced economic demand, because there would be fewer people buying houses and cars and groceries, and that would reduce tax revenue even further. And if mass deportation occurred rapidly over 1 year instead of 4, primary deficits would increase to $986.8 billion over 10 years.
Nearly $1 trillion in increased deficits. This is not fiscal conservatism. This is fiscal catastrophe. And Kamala had warned about this during her campaign, saying that it was going to cost the American people
tons of money,
billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah.
And Elon Musk said, it may get really bad.
Yeah.
This is setting fire to the economy to satisfy a xenophobic fantasy. And the human cost is incalculable. Children growing up without parents, elderly parents losing caregivers, patients losing home health aides, farms losing workers, construction sites shutting down,
Yep.
restaurants closing. This is not immigration enforcement. This is social demolition.
And I think it's done on purpose.
It is.
It is. This is the reset that's coming, and it's going to hit hard. We need to pivot here because the engine driving all of this enforcement, the billions of dollars, the detention centers, the deportation flights, the family separations, is a specific narrative that has been repeated so often it has achieved the status of common sense for millions of Americans. The narrative that immigrants bring crime, that they make communities less safe, that the border is a chaotic floodgate for criminals and gang members and terrorists. It is a story told in campaign ads with ominous music and grainy footage. It is told on cable news with breathless urgency and chyrons that scream border crisis. It is told in legislative hearings where politicians demand more funding for enforcement because we have to protect American communities. It is the idea that immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, are inherently dangerous, inherently criminal, inherently a threat, and I say BS.
But here's the thing about narratives. They can't be fact-checked. They can be tested against reality. They can be measured. And when you actually look at the data, real data, compiled by researchers using rigorous methods and peer-reviewed standards, the crime myth collapses completely. The American Immigration Council recently conducted one of the most comprehensive analysis of the relationships between immigration and crime ever undertaken. They used FBI uniform crime reporting data, which tracks crimes reported to law enforcement, Census Bureau population data, which tracks demographic changes. They examined all 50 states and the District of Columbia between 2017 and 2022, looking for correlations between the immigrant share of the population and the crime rates.
And what did they find? They found no statistically significant correlation between the immigrant share of the population and the total crime rate. None. Zero. Nada. The relationship doesn't exist. States with high immigrant populations don't have higher crime rates. States with low immigrant populations don't have lower crime rates. The two variables are independent. If the crime myths were true, you would see a clear pattern. As the immigrant population rises, crime should rise. But that pattern doesn't exist. In fact, the pattern that does exist points in the opposite direction. And when I pointed that out to good old Pastor, that it was more white individuals creating crime. I mean, I'm talking about thousands and thousands. He dared to say that I was the racist. No, I said, I'm pointing out your hypocrisy.
Projection doesn't.
No, it's like, I'm just telling you, you're saying that the immigrants are the violent ones. I know. You can't make this stuff up.
He wants to be
white. Yeah.
He's like, you don't know it, but I am an undercover Latino. And you're like, dude,
I knew you were Latino.
Yeah,
from the very beginning. But I've seen a lot of Latinos who will poo-poo on their race because it's Stockholm Syndrome. We've been traumatized to not like who we are because we have to be like the white man, you know? And it's like, no, we need to be proud of who we are because it's been too many centuries and years and eons that if you're not white and you're another color or another race or whatever, you've been poo-pooed upon by the white man. Yeah. You've been your culture has been removed and theirs has been forced and the religion down your throat. Enough is enough.
I am convinced that the entire African continent was a continent of royalty.
Oh, totally.
That they were stripped of their dignity and their place in history by a white predatory colonialist that took advantage of good people.
Yeah, that's what they've always done.
Yeah. Let's look at the long-term trend because it's even more striking. Between 1980 and 2022, 42 years, the immigrant share of the U.S. population more than doubled, from 6.2% to 13.9%. 42 years during which immigration, both legal and undocumented, increased dramatically. If the crime myth were true, if immigrants bring crime, you would expect crime to skyrocket during that same period. You would expect American communities to become literal war zones. That's the prediction the myth makes. But what actually happened?
The total crime rate fell by 60.4%. 64 points from 5,900 crimes per 100,000 people in 1982 to 2,335 in 2022. Violent crime, murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault fell by 34.5%. Property crime, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft fell by 63.3%. The immigrant population doubled and crime was cut in half. The relationship is not just uncorrelated, it's inversely correlated. Immigration went up, crime went down. That doesn't prove causation, but it absolutely demolishes the claim that immigrant causes crime. Don't you think?
The recent data tells the same story. In 2017, immigrants were 13.7% of the U.S. population, and the crime rate was 2,758 per 100,000. But by 2022, immigrants were 13.8% of the population, essentially unchanged, a trivial increase of 0.1%. And the crime rate had fallen to 2,335 per 100,000. That's a 15.3% decrease in crime. During a period when the immigration population was stable, crime fell significantly. If immigrants were driving crime, crime should have remained stable too, but it didn't.
And state level data is even more striking because it allows us to compare native born citizen and immigrants directly. In Texas, which tracks immigration status and arrest data more carefully than most states, U.S. born citizens were more than twice as likely to be arrested for violent crimes.
What was that?
20, what is it? I'll slow it down. Twice as likely to be arrested for violent crimes compared to undocumented immigrants. More than twice as likely. 2.5 times as likely to be arrested for drug crimes. 4 times as likely to be arrested for property crimes.
Oh, wow.
Native-born citizens are arrested at higher rates than undocumented immigrants for every major category of crime. I'll be understanding that it's not a immigrant crime problem that we're having. It's called an white man racial problem towards the immigrants. The people we're told to fear are actually less likely to commit crimes than the people doing the fear mongering because, they're working really hard and to buy a house, to integrate their lives into America, the place that made their country shit because of sanctions, because of bullying tactics the United States is really good at.
Helping governments, actions.
Yeah, taking the leaders away and forcing things into their country. So what do people have to do? They have to come here because America has made their country a piece of manure. That's how it goes.
And now people are going back to certain countries and realizing that it's better there. I just saw a post on Facebook. Woman was deported in 2018 and she didn't know what she was going to do back in Mexico and stuff. And she has become quite successful.
That's awesome.
Researchers have also found that immigrant communities tend to revitalize neighborhoods, particularly in urban areas that have experienced disinvestment and population loss. Immigrants open businesses, bodegas, restaurants, repair shops, stores that white people love, that create foot traffic and informal surveillance. They watch the street. They know their neighbors. They have a great sense of family. They create social cohesion and informal social control. They have strong family structures and community networks that discourage criminal behavior. They have a lot to lose. Undocumented immigrants in particular avoid any contact with law enforcement because they fear deportation. So they're actually more law-abiding than the average citizen.
So why does the myth persist if the data so clearly refutes it? Well, because fear sells and fear legislates. What did Trump run on? The fear of immigrants. They're eating the cats and dogs. And fear wins elections. Politicians who want to appear tough on crime, who want to activate racial anxiety, who want to distract from economic inequality and failing infrastructures can always point to immigrants as the source of disorder and insecurity, or the trans people, or the gay people. It's an old playbook. Find a vulnerable group, call them dangerous, promise to protect the majority from them, and reap the political rewards. Every generation believes that their immigration crisis is different, that this time the threat is real, that this group is uniquely unassimilatable, uniquely criminal, uniquely dangerous.
The Irish were called violent drunks and criminals, and now they're celebrated. We have an Irish Catholic president. Irish Americans run corporations and universities. Italians were called members of the mafia. Anarchist degenerates, and now Italian Americans are fully integrated into American life. Chinese were called unassimilable.
Some words in this language.
Unassimilable.
Yeah.
Incapable of loyalty to America. A threat to white civilization. And now Chinese Americans are doctors and engineers and judges. I saw how the medical community in Minneapolis was rising up and speaking against what had happened with Renee Good and all of ICE's actions and stuff. And I couldn't help but notice how most of the doctors were literally like, smart Indian people, or Pakistani people,
or from elsewhere,
or Filipino, or So the pattern is clear. The fear is projected onto the newcomers, whoever they are, and then it fades as they integrate, and a new group becomes the target. The fear is rarely about the people being feared. It's about economic anxiety, status anxiety, cultural change, the discomfort of a changing nation.
And the cost of that projection is measured in broken families, destroyed lives, communities living in terror of enforcement. The cost is 230,000 deportation in a single year. The cost is children coming home from school to find their parents gone. The cost is nearly $30 billion spent on enforcement instead of infrastructures or education or even healthcare. The cost is the human potential wasted, the contributions never made, the future never realized, all to satisfy a myth.
We've talked about the cost of enforcement, nearly $30 billion and climbing. We've talked about the fiscal costs of mass deportation, nearly $1 trillion in increasing deficits over 10 years. But what about the value of presence? What about the economic contribution of immigrants, documented and undocumented? Because that contribution is not speculative. It's not theoretical. It's documented. It is measurable. It's impossible to ignore if you're willing to look at the data honestly.
In 2024, 46.2% of Fortune 500 companies, 231 firms were founded by immigrants or their children. Almost half of the largest, most successful companies in America, almost half. These companies generated $8.6 trillion in revenue in 2024. $8.6 trillion. That's more than the GDP of every country or county on earth except the United States and China. And they've employed over 15 million people globally, 15 million jobs created by companies founded by immigrants or their children. 18.4% of Fortune 500 companies were funded by immigrants themselves. 24.8% were founded by the children of immigrants.
Think about that for a moment. Immigrants account for less than 14% of the US population, but they found nearly 25% of all new businesses. They are disproportionately entrepreneurial, disproportionately willing to take risks, to invest their savings, to work 80-hour weeks to build something. 1/3 of venture-backed companies, the startups that become the Googles and the Apples of tomorrow, are founded by immigrants. Half of Silicon Valley high-tech startups are founded by immigrants. The technology sector, which drives American economic growth and global competitiveness, is built on immigrant talent and immigrant ambition.
We watched a movie. It was a Mexican immigrant family, and he was raised here, and they would come for the season, and he became an astronaut or something very prestige.
Oh yeah, he became an astronaut.
Right.
He flew in the space shuttle.
Seattle. Yeah. It's like, just because we don't speak like you, just because we don't look like you, just because we come from a different culture and country, doesn't mean that we're not smart. Doesn't mean that we're criminals. It's very offensive and very ignorant.
Yeah, I mean, when I was working, doing some delivery driving part time back in 2021, I was in Washington and in Seattle, close to like the Microsoft headquarters. I would be delivering to different places, picking up at different places, and there was a huge community of Indian, culture, and it was so fascinating because you know that these are all techie, smart, super smart
Super
people
smart and hardworking.
that are basically given visas to come to this country to make American companies better.
Mhm.
And, they had a thriving immigrant population and a thriving like restaurants and culture. You could just feel the familial, connections and stuff. It was just a beautiful
Very
thing to
hardworking
watch.
individuals. I mean, immigrants, whether you're Mexican, Hindu,
Vietnamese came
Filipino,
over, yeah.
wherever it is, hardworking, good values. I don't understand the bone you have to pick with immigrants just because there's a few bad apples. Well, there's a lot more bad apples
We've
native
seen
born in the United
We've read it.
States,
We've
and we've
read
read it,
the
we've seen
stats.
it. So why don't you have issues with that? But the contribution isn't just at the top, isn't just billionaires and tech founders. It's at every level of the economy, in every sector, in every community. In 2023, nearly 1 in 5 workers, 19%, were immigrants. That's up from 15% to 2 decades earlier. Immigration has been the major driving force behind U.S. behind the U.S. labor force growth over the past 20 years. Without immigration, the American labor force would be shrinking as the native-born population ages and birth rates decline. Without immigration, there would be labor shortages across the economy, driving up costs and reducing output because somehow a lot of the native-borns don't want to work. They just don't.
And historically, immigration has been the engine of American industrialization. The reason America became the world's largest economy between 1880 and 1920, the peak years of immigration before the 1924 restrictions, the number of gainful workers in the United States more than doubled from 18.1 million to 40.5 million. Almost half of that growth, 11 million workers, came from first and second generation immigrants. By 1920, immigrants and their children made up 40% of the American workforce. They were the mainstay of the industrial workforce. The people who built the factories, dug the mines, laid the railroads, operated the machinery, and loaded the ships.
And as immigrants occupied lower skilled positions, not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked English and credentials and connections, they made it possible for native-born workers to move into higher paid, higher status occupations. Immigration didn't crowd out native workers. It pushed them up to the economic ladder. It created opportunities for advancement, for specialization, for management roles. The economy expanded because there were more workers producing more goods, creating more demand, generating more investment. Immigration was growth.
And immigrants contributed to unionization, which is contrary to the narrative that immigrants undermine labor organizing. Between 1900 and 1920, immigration actually fueled the growth of organized labor. For every 100 immigrants entering the average U.S. county, UN union membership increased by nearly 20 workers. Immigrants joined unions. They organized strikes. They fought for better wages and working conditions. Without immigration, the average union density between 1900 and 1920 would have been approximately 22% lower. The labor movement was built in significant part by immigrant workers.
Today, undocumented immigrants alone, people living and working in the shadows, people who can be deported at any moment, people who have no work authorization, contribute $96.7 billion in taxes annually. And they don't get any of that back. That's federal, state, and local taxes combined. Income taxes, payroll taxes, property taxes, sale taxes, gas taxes, excise taxes, $96.7 billion. Given that the undocumented population included 10.9 million people in 2022, that's approximately $8,889 per person. They're paying taxes at rates comparable to native-born citizens, even though they can't access most of the benefit those taxes fund. No Social Security, no Medicare, no unemployment insurance, no food stamps, no Medicaid in most states.
And that's without work authorization, without legal status, with all the disadvantages and exploitation that come from being undocumented. If all undocumented immigrants were granted work authorization tomorrow, which it seems like Spain is doing, they're actually making their illegal population legal.
That would make sense, and it's be more profitable.
Yeah, if they could work legally, negotiate fair wages, switch employers without fear, their tax contributions would rise by $40.2 billion per year to $136.9 billion. Most of that new revenue, $33.1 billion, would flow straight into the coffers of the federal government to fund defense, Social Security, Medicare, and federal programs. The remainder, $7.1 billion, would flow to states and localities to fund schools, police, roads, public services. This is money we're leaving on the table because of ideology, because of racism, because of fear, because of a refusal to legalize people who are already here and their children who've been here and already contributing.
Imagine all the money we would save if we fired and got rid of the thugs that they have out there, all that money that's been given to ICE. And we took that money to help legalize those undocumented, make them documented, and allow them to run freely in our country and contribute. That to me seems like a better business plan than the plan that Trump is putting out there. Undocumented immigrants are also overrepresented in essential industries, the industries that kept the country running during COVID, that keeps food on our tables, that keep our homes clean, that care for our elderly. 1 in 20 essential workers are undocumented. 400,000 architectural workers picking fruits and vegetables, working in brutal heat, earning poverty wages. 400,000 cleaning staff, which Trump has used in his Trump Tower and hotels, but he didn't have a problem with them then. Cleaning staff, disinfecting hospitals and office buildings, emptying trash, scrubbing toilets. 300,000 packers, stockers, shippers of essential goods, keeping supply chains moving. 100,000 home health and personal care aides, bathing, feeding, and caring for your disabled and elderly parents.
In construction, 1.3 million undocumented workers. They're building houses, apartment buildings, office towers, roads, bridges, hospitals, schools. I mean, I saw this one ICE raid. These guys are putting a roof on a house, and ICE is telling them to come off the roof to be like arrested. It's like these people are contributing to the economy. They're feeding the industrial engine, and they're not able to do their job just because they want them.
It's a poor business model. It's just a cruel, poor business model. It has no place in our world.
In restaurants, 846,000 undocumented workers. If you like a chalupa, if you like fajitas,
tacos,
if you like Asian
burritos.
food, I mean, what are you doing? They're cooking, serving, washing dishes, keeping the food service industry running. 54% of foreign-born workers in agriculture are undocumented. 50% in construction. I remember early on, Trump was raiding farms in California, and the farmers were like, whoa, 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 whoa.
What are you doing?
What? Do you like lettuce? Do you like vegetables?
Yeah.
And then he had to back down and say, oh, yeah, the good people. 40% in disinfection services. These industries would collapse without undocumented labor. Food would rot in fields if it hasn't already. Construction would grind to a halt if it hasn't already. Restaurants would close. Your favorite places would not be around. Elderly Americans would lose their caregivers.
These are not abstract numbers. These are the people who built temporary hospitals during COVID while risking their own health and their family's health. These are the people who cleaned medical facilities, who delivered home health care services, who stocked grocery store shelves when everyone else was sheltering at home, who put food on our tables. And most of them have been here for more than a decade. They lived in established families. They own homes. They send their kids to public schools. They coach little leagues. They volunteer at church. They are our neighbors, our coworkers, our friends. They are integrated into American life in every way except legal status.
The system we've built treats them as a security threat first and a human being second. It treats them as disposable, as exploitable, as deportable. It denies them the ability to come out of the shadows, to work legally, to negotiate fair wages, to report workplace violations. I'm sure many of these work in these Swanson packing plants, and they hire undocumented workers for their chicken and their beef plants, and to call the police when they're victims of crime. It creates a permanent underclass that can be exploited by people like that, by foster farms and others, by unscrupulous employers, and abused by criminals who know their victims won't go to the police. And then it blames them for the conditions it created.
So instead of going after the undocumented, why don't you go after the corporations that hire the undocumented? They're the just as much of aiding and abetting, but no, can't touch the elites. The economic reality is undeniable. Immigrants create more than they cost. They contribute more than they take. They build more than they destroy. The Fortune 500 data proves it. The tax revenue data proves it. The labor force data proves it. The historical data proves it. But the system doesn't operate on reality. It operates on fear, on mythology, on the political utility of having a scapegoat. And that brings us to the hardest question of the investigation.
The question of trafficking. We come now to the most difficult question of this investigation, and we need to be precise about what we're asking, because this is not rhetorical. This is not metaphorical. This is a legal question with legal definitions and legal consequences. Is the United States government engaged in practices that meet the legal definition of human trafficking under both U.S. and international law? Let's be clear about what we're asking and what we're not asking. We're not asking whether individual ICE agents are trafficking people in the criminal sense for profit or exploitation. We are asking whether the state itself, through coercion, deception, and the deliberate removal of legal protections, is engaging in the forcible transfer of human beings under conditions that violate both domestic and international law.
Human trafficking under both U.S. law, the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, and international law, the UN Palermo Protocol, is defined as the abuse of force, fraud, or coercion to exploit a person for labor or commercial purposes. The key elements are force, fraud, coercion, and exploitation. We're going to examine current immigration enforcement practices against each one of these elements. And we're going to let the documented facts speak for themselves. Let's start with coercion, and specifically with coerced voluntary departure.
Multiple reports from human rights organizations and legal aid groups document ICE agents pressuring detained immigrants, including separated parents desperately trying to reunite with their children, to sign voluntary departure agreements by falsely promising reunification with their children or faster release. Voluntary departure is a legal mechanism that allows someone to leave the United States at their own expense. Kristi Noem says, and if you don't want to get caught, we can have you self-deport yourself, which sounds neutral enough until you understand what people are giving up. By signing voluntary departure, you waive your right to a hearing before an immigration judge. You waive your right to present evidence, to call witnesses, to have a lawyer argue on your behalf. You waive your right to seek asylum, to apply for relief from removal, to challenge the government's case against you. You give up everything in exchange for the promise that you can leave on your own terms.
Human Rights Watch interviewed 58 parents who were separated from their children under the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy in 2018. The parents reported that ICE agents told them they would be reunited with their children if they signed voluntary departure forms. That was a lie. A deliberate, systematic lie designed to get people to waive their legal rights. They're so, ugh. Signing voluntary departure waived their rights to a hearing, waived their rights to seek asylum. Many of these parents were fleeing violence and persecuted and had valid asylum claims, and it did not guarantee reunification. In many cases, parents signed and were deported while their children remained in the U.S. custody, sometimes for months, sometimes scattered across multiple states, sometimes with no clear plan for reunification.
The National Immigrant Justice Center, which provides legal services to detained immigrants, warns that DHS routinely uses voluntary departure as leverage to convince someone to waive their rights. This is not an isolated practice. This is policy. This is standard operating procedure. In April 2025, mothers detained in Louisiana were told that their U.S. citizen children would be deported with them to their countries of origin. Let me repeat that. U.S. citizen children born on American soil with full constitutional rights, were told they would be deported.
The mothers were given no alternative, no ability to arrange custody with family members in the United States, no ability to contact relatives, no time to consult with lawyers. One child was receiving active cancer treatment at a children's hospital. ICE removed him from the country without his medication, without his medical records, without consulting his oncologist or his treatment team. The child's health was jeopardized. Potentially, his life was jeopardized because ICE wanted to meet a deportation quota, wanted to remove the mother quickly without the complication of arranging custody for her citizen children.
Attorneys for the mothers stated in court filings, ICE's representation of consent is categorically false and a blatant lie. The mothers did not consent. They were coerced. They were told their children would be deported if they didn't cooperate. They were told they had no other options. They were told that resistance was futile. This is coercion by definition, using a person's desperation, separation from children, fear for their children's safety and well-being, to force them into waiving legal rights, into accepting deportation without due process, into giving up claims that might have succeeded if they'd been allowed to present them.
Second element, fraud. Telling people they have no legal options when they do, telling them they cannot apply for asylum when they can, telling them they will be reunited with their children when they won't. In February 2025, Border Patrol agents were sued by United Farmer Workers and Bakersfield residents for stopping, detaining, and transporting farm workers to detention facilities, specifically to coerce them into voluntary departure, a form of summary expulsion which can result in a years-long bar on reentry. The lawsuit alleges that agents told farm workers they had no right to see a judge, no right to a lawyer, no right to challenge their removal, all of which are lies under current law.
Third element, force. Since January 2025, DHS has expanded expedited removal to its maximum geographic and temporal extent. Expedited removal is a process created in 1996 that allows immigration officers, not judges, officers, to make final deportation decisions after a brief interview, sometimes lasting only minutes. Originally, expedited removal applied only to people apprehended at ports of entry or within 14 days and 100 miles of the border. Now, it applies to anywhere in the United States, to anyone who cannot prove they've been in the country continuously for more than 2 years.
This process has been used to dismiss active immigration cases, cases pending before immigration judges where people had lawyers and were presenting evidence, and immediately rearrest people to funnel them into expedited removal, bypassing immigration courts entirely. People with pending asylum claims have been deported without hearings. People with legal status, people with work permits, people with pending applications for green cards have been deported without hearing. By October 2025, over 40,000 people have been arrested who had never been charged with any crimes and for whom DHS had not removal orders. 40,000 people subjected to forcible removal without judicial process, without any findings by a judge that they should be deported. So the lies of we're just removing the criminals is a lie.
It is. This is the legal machinery of mass displacement operating outside judicial oversight, outside constitutional constraints. This is force, the physical removal of human beings from their homes, their communities, their families, without the due process that is supposed to be guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment, which applies to all persons in the United States, not just citizens. And it brings us to the most extreme example, the Alien Enemies Act, deportations to Secot prison in El Salvador.
On March 14, 2025, President Trump secretly invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. The Alien Enemy Act is a wartime statute, one of 4 alien and sedition acts passed during the quasi-war with France. It allows the president to detain or deport nationals of a country which the United States is at war. The key phrase "at war," the United States is not at war with Venezuela. Congress has not declared war. There is no armed conflict. But on March 14th, Trump invoked the act anyway and ordered the deportation of Venezuelans to a foreign prison. And then he goes in and invades Venezuela and takes their leader out. Is that psychotic?
On that day, 238 Venezuelans were deported to El Salvador and imprisoned in Secot, the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism, a notorious mega prison built by the Salvadoran government to hold gang members and terrorism suspects. 137 were deported explicitly under the Alien Enemies Act. 101 were deported under regular immigration law but sent to the same prison. They were not given trials. They were not given hearings. They were not given lawyers. They were not given release dates. They were simply taken from U.S. detention facilities, put on planes, and delivered to a foreign government to be imprisoned indefinitely.
They were sent despite active immigration cases, including pending asylum claims. They were sent despite federal court orders. 4 of the 5 deportation flights were blocked by federal judges, but the administration continued the flights anyway. This is not law enforcement. This is lawlessness. This is a deliberate defiance of judicial authority, the deliberate removal of people to a location beyond the reach of U.S. courts so they cannot petition for habeas corpus, cannot challenge their detention, cannot access American lawyers or American judges.
Among those deported was a man named Gilmar Abrego Garcia. Abrego Garcia had withholding of removal, a legal protection granted by an immigration judge after a full hearing with evidence and testimony. Withholding of removal means that the government has determined that if you are deported to a specific country, you will face persecution or torture, and therefore U.S. law prohibits your deportation to that country. It is a binding legal protection, enforceable in federal court. Abrego Garcia had withholding of removal protecting him from deportation to El Salvador because his life would be in danger there.
His deportation was illegal under the U.S. law. There is no ambiguity here, no legal gray area. The government had a court order prohibiting his deportation to El Salvador, and they deported him to El Salvador anyway. He was imprisoned at Secot with the very gang members he had fled, the people who had threatened to kill him, the reason he sought protection in the United States in the first place. His wife learned of his removal by recognizing him in photographs published by the El Salvador government. Photographs of men forced into prone positions on the ground, hands behind their heads, surrounded by armed guards. She recognized her husband lying face down in the dirt.
On April 10, 2025, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously 9-0, every justice, including the most conservative, that his removal was unlawful. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the court, the United States acknowledges that Abrego Garcia was subject to a withholding order forbidding his removal to El Salvador, and that the removal to El Salvador was therefore illegal. Government acknowledged it, admitted they broke the law. They admitted they illegally deported a man who had legal protection. And what did they do in response to a unanimous Supreme Court ruling ordering them to bring him back?
They stalled. They obfuscated. They claimed he must present at a port of entry to re-enter the United States. Think about that. The man was illegally deported by the U.S. government in violation of a court order. The Supreme Court ruled his deportation illegal and ordered the government to facilitate his return. And the government said he must travel thousands of miles from El Salvador, somehow cross multiple borders, and present himself at a U.S. port of entry as if he were a new applicant for admission. Attorneys called this response blatant lies and accused the government of evading accountability.
In December 2025, a federal judge ruled that deportations under the Alien Enemies Act violated due process. The administration's interpretation of the act was unconstitutional, that the deportations must stop. The administration has continued the practice. This is not a system that occasionally makes mistakes. This is a system operating outside the law, defying court orders, using a foreign prison to hold people beyond the reach of judicial review. This is the use of force to transfer human beings to a location where they have no legal protections, no ability to challenge their detention, no access to American due process.
Fourth element, conditions amounting to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatments. In December 2025, Amnesty International released a report on immigration detention facilities in Florida. The report focused on two facilities, Chrome Detention Center, which I used to work for before when I was 19, which has been operating for decades, and a new facility in the Everglades opened in July 2025, which detainees called Alligator Alcatraz. Because of its remote location surrounded by swampland, Chrome has severe overcrowding, with detainees sleeping on floors and in hallways. Medical neglect, yes, with detainees reporting untreated infections, dental emergencies ignored, chronic conditions unmanaged, prolonged solitary confinement used as punishment for minor infractions.
Amnesty International concluded that prolonged solitary confinement, isolation in a cell for 22 or more hours per day for weeks or months, amounts to torture under international law. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has repeatedly stated that solitary confinement beyond 15 days constitutes torture because of its severe psychological effects. At Chrome, detainees reported being held in solitary for months. The Everglades facility, Alligator Alcatraz, opened in July 2025 with a capacity of 3,000 detainees. Within months, it was overcrowded.
Detainees report conditions that are almost medieval in their cruelty. Overflowing toilets with fecal matter seeping into sleeping areas where people sleep, on thin mats, on concrete floors, limited access to showers, sometimes one shower per week in a facility holding thousands in the Florida heat and humidity. Exposure to insects, mosquitoes, roaches, flies, because the facility is in a swamp. Lights on 24 hours a day, making sleep nearly impossible. Poor food and inadequate water, with detainees reporting constant hunger and dehydration. And the use of the box, quote unquote, solitary confinement cells as punishment for complaining about conditions.
Amnesty's conclusion: conditions amount to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Under international human rights law, this is not hyperbole from activists. This is Amnesty International, one of the most respected human rights organizations in the world, with rigorous research standards and legal expertise. They investigated, they interviewed detainees and staff, they reviewed medical records and facility documents, and they concluded that what is happening in these facilities amounts to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Florida has increased its detained immigrant population by over 50% since January 2025, cramming more people into facilities that are already overcrowded, already failing to meet basic standards of humane treatment.
Discriminatory agreements between local police and ICE, 287 agreements, have led to wrongful arrests, racial profiling, and widespread fear. Throughout Florida's immigrant communities, people are afraid to drive to work, afraid to take their kids to school, afraid to go to the grocery store because any interaction with police can result in detention and deportation. This is the lived reality of immigration, an entire population living in fear, living in the shadows, vulnerable to exploitation and abuse because they cannot call the police, cannot assert their rights, cannot access the legal system.
So let's return to this question. Is this trafficking? Let's check the elements. Coercion, falsely promising reunification with children or faster release to secure waivers of legal rights documented in multiple reports. Fraud, telling people they have no legal options when they do, telling them that they cannot see a judge when they can, telling them consent is voluntary when it's coerced, documented in lawsuits and legal filings. Force, physical removal without judicial review, deportation despite court orders, use of expedited removal to bypass immigration courts, and documented by DHS's own statistics.
And let's not forget that it is a business. It is these detention centers that Trump wants to build throughout,
Oh, yeah.
the world. Just like prisons are a business. This rabbit hole goes very deep. Exploitation using human beings to meet arrest quotas and political targets, generating statistics for press releases, using deportation as campaign talking points, documented in administration statements, cruel, inhuman and degrading treatments, detentions and conditions. Amnesty International calls torture, prolonged solitary confinement, medical neglect, exposure to filth and vermin, documented in the Amnesty report, and the use of a foreign prison, CICOT in El Salvador, beyond the reach of U.S. courts to hold people indefinitely without trial, without hearings, without release dates, documented in Supreme Court filings.
This isn't conspiracy theory. This isn't speculation. This is documented in court filings, Supreme Court rulings, Amnesty International reports, Human Rights Watch investigations, legal aid organization testimonies, and the government's own admissions. The question isn't whether this looks bad or feels wrong. The question is whether it's legal, whether it comports with U.S. law and international human rights obligations, whether it meets the definition and practices the United States claims to oppose. And increasingly, the answer from courts, from human rights organizations, from legal scholars is no.
This is a system that operates through coercion, fraud, and force, that holds people in conditions amounting to torture, that defies court orders, that illegally deports people with legal protections, that separates children from parents and uses the separation as leverage, that makes U.S. citizen children choose between their country and their parents, that uses a foreign prison to circumvent American law. This is not immigration enforcement. This is state-sanctioned cruelty designed to terrorize a population into leaving, into self-deporting, into giving up rather than fighting for their rights.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground tonight, from the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to deportations of 2025, from the eugenic theories of Madison Grant and Harry Laughlin to the crimmigration machine that now costs $30 billion and more per year, from Buck versus Bell to the Executive Order 9066 to expedited removal and the Alien Enemies Act, from Angel Island interrogations to CICOT, prison deportations, from the invention of the illegal alien, quote unquote, as a legal category, to the systematic use of coercion and fraud to bypass due process. The pattern is clear, and it is consistent across 143 years. Fear sells, fear legislates, and fear strips people of rights.
And it brings out the racist in people that are supporting this. That's why they aligned with Trump in the first place.
Oh, yeah.
Every generation believes that their immigration crisis is different, that this time the threat is real, that this group is uniquely dangerous, uniquely unassimilable, uniquely incapable of becoming American. The Chinese were called unassimilable, incapable of loyalty, carriers of disease and opium addiction. The Italians were called criminals and anarchists, genetically defective, culturally backwards. The Jews were called communists and capitalists simultaneously, accused of undermining both labor and business, deemed feeble-minded by eugenicists. The Japanese were called enemy aliens and imprisoned without trial. And each case, history proved the fears wrong, proved the accusation false, proved the exclusions unjust.
The Irish were hated, called drunks and savages, and now they're celebrated. We have an Irish Catholic president. Irish Americans run corporations. I don't think we have an Irish Catholic president anymore. We have a German president.
Yeah.
German-Danish president or something. The Italians were undesirable, and now Italian food is American food. Italian Americans are fully integrated. The Chinese were excluded for 61 years, and now Chinese Americans are scientists and engineers and judges. Japanese were in prison, and now Japanese Americans have served in the Senate, in the cabinet, as military generals. The pattern is clear. The fear is projected on the newcomers, whoever they happen to be at the moment in history, like the Somalis and the Haitians. Then it fades as they integrate, and a new group becomes a target. The fear is rarely about the people being feared. It's about economic anxiety, status anxiety, cultural change, the discomfort of a changing nation.
Or political ploy being used to use people's racist feelings. The question is, how long do we keep repeating the cycle? How many more families have to be separated? How many more children have to grow up without parents? How many more people have to die in detention or be deported to danger? How much more money do we have to spend on enforcement that doesn't make us safer, that doesn't reduce crime, that doesn't improve the economy? We have a system that costs nearly $30 billion a year to enforce, a vision of America that statistically, economically, historically doesn't match reality.
The reality is that immigration is not a crisis. It's a constant. It's been constant since before this country even existed. It is driven by desperation, yes, by violence and poverty and climate change and political repression, but it's also driven by hope, by ambition, by the belief that a better life is possible, by the desire to work and build and contribute. The laws we write are a choice. We choose exclusion in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. We chose eugenics based quotas in 1924. We chose internment in 1944. And today we're choosing criminalization, choosing crimmigration, choosing enforcement, ICE over integration, choosing walls over welcome.
But laws can be rewritten, policies can be changed, systems can be dismantled or redirected. It starts with recognizing that person's on the other side of the paperwork. That person in the detention cell, that person on the deportation flight is not an alien. They are a human being with rights, with dignity, with a family, with dreams. They are a neighbor in waiting. The architects of the 1924 Immigration Act believed that some human beings were genetically inferior, than their presence would pollute the American gene pool, that allowing them to reproduce will create a degenerate future population. Those architects were wrong, catastrophically wrong, and history has proven them wrong.
Madison Grant's passing of the Great Race was Adolf Hitler's Bible. Think about that. The Immigration Act that Grant helped draft closed the doors to Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust. Thousands died. Harry Laughlin received an honorary degree from the University of Heidelberg in 1936 for his contributions to eugenics, an honor bestowed by the Nazi government. The legal architecture of exclusion that America built in the 1920s became a model for Nazi racial laws. We know the cost of that choice. 6 million Jews murdered, millions of others killed, a world war, the greatest catastrophe in human history, and America's restrictive immigration laws contributed to it by closing the door to refugees who otherwise could have been saved.
Today we're making new choices, and we are at a similar hinge point in history. Choices about who deserves due process and who can be subjected to expedited removal without a hearing. Choices about who can be coerced into signing away their rights and who can be detained indefinitely in conditions amounting to torture. Choices about whether a U.S. citizen child can be removed from the country because their parent is undocumented. The choices about whether a man with legal protection from deportation can be illegally sent to a foreign prison and the government can defy a Supreme Court order to bring him back. These are not hypotheticals, not thought experiments. They are happening now, today, in our names, with our tax dollars, under our laws.
And the question is not whether the system is broken. The question is whether it is doing exactly what it was designed to do. If the goal is exclusion based on race and national origin, well, the system is working perfectly. 92% of deportees are people of color, just as they were under the 1924 quotas. If the goal is to deter migration by making the process so cruel that people will not attempt it, Trump brags about the fact that he has sealed off the border. The families will self-deport rather than endure separation, that asylum seekers will give up rather than face detention. That system is working perfectly. If the goal is to exploit fear for political gain, as has been done with Trump, to activate racial anxiety, as has been done with Trump, to provide a scapegoat for economic insecurity, as has been done with Trump, the system is working perfectly. But if the goal is justice, the system was failing woefully, catastrophically.
We can choose differently. We can choose to recognize that the United States has always been built by immigrants. 46% of Fortune 500 companies were funded by immigrants or their children. That immigrants contribute nearly $100 billion in taxes annually. That crime rates have fallen as immigration has risen. The immigrants are revitalizing communities and growing the economy and caring for our elderly and picking our food. We can choose to recognize that immigrants are not the problem. They are part of the solution. And the system that criminalizes them, that detains them in torturous conditions, that deports them in defiance of court orders, that separates them from their children is the problem.
The machinery of exclusion was built deliberately over decades by people with names and titles and theories about racial superiority. Charles Davenport, Harry Laughlin built the eugenics record office and lobbied Congress. Madison Grant wrote The Passing of the Great Race, helped draft the Immigration Act of 1924. Albert Sidney Priddy sterilized Carrie Buck. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. John DeWitt recommended Japanese internment. Hugo Black wrote the Korematsu opinion. These were not anonymous forces of history. These were people making choices, and their choices shaped the system we live under today.
Yeah, it's
almost done.
the system can be dismantled by people making different choices. The question is whether we have the will, whether we have the courage, whether we have the moral clarity to recognize cruelty when we see it and to demand that it stop. The question is whether we can look at a mother that is being told that her U.S. citizen child will be deported and say that's wrong. Whether we can look at a man illegally deported despite a court order protecting him and saying that's lawless. Whether we can look at people held in solitary confinement and conditioned amnesty calls to torture and say that's inhumane. Whether we can look at a system that costs $30 billion and produce misery and say we can do better.
Machinery of exclusion can be dismantled. The choice is ours to make. Yeah, I mean, it's our choice. We can understand that we've done wrong. We could take this country in a different direction for the first time in its history.
But as long as we have white supremacists, races, individuals in politics running the show, oligarchs, elitists that think that they know better than everybody else, then it would always repeat itself over and over again.
Well, the danger now is that they don't need people to power their companies anymore. They don't need people to power their industry.
That's what I was thinking. That's what I was thinking. It's like they're doing this right now because they know that the jobs will be done with AI.
Mm-hmm.
So they're literally doing their eugenics, cleaning house so that they don't have to.
Well, they know that humans can't reproduce as much as they used to be able to. I mean, the birth rate in this country has fallen precipitously since 1950s.
So, immigration has a very dark side to it. And for those of you that still believe that we need to get rid of the criminal immigrants, there are very few criminal immigrants. There are hardworking people that come to this country, as I mentioned before, because their country has been messed with by the U.S. So they come here to make a living, to make a better life. And why are you trying to stop these people and creating all these lies?
And the numbers don't lie, because the more immigrants that do come to this country, the lower the crime rate is. The lower the crime rate is. Yeah. So it's exactly opposite of what you think and have been told by the Trump administration is true.
Totally. Well, guys, we've rambled on long enough, but we thank you for watching. If you watch this later, or if you watch now, we thank you again. Remember to subscribe, hit that notification button. Think about the things that we have said. Be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Don't believe the lies. Don't believe what this administration is trying to do. It's trying to tear humanity apart, literally.
It really is.
Okay, guys, we love you, but remember to always love yourselves too. Good night.
Good night.
Las marcas que lleva por siempre estarán. Recuerdan las luchas que él ha enfrentado. No hay a quien culpar, nada que cambiar. Es solo como es su historia y verdad. Al mirar el espejo te justificas. Estás feliz con lo que ves. Sí, bendecido serás, pues intentas juzgar, intentas cambiarlo, mas no puedes quitarle quien estaba destinado a ser. Al mirar el espejo te justificas, estás feliz con lo que ves por dentro y por fuera. Si la respuesta es sí, bendecido serás, pues para algunos el espejo no tiene sentido. Creen que somos pecado y que mentimos también al tratar de igualar nuestro ser con la piel. Mira en tu corazón y pregúntate hoy por qué tanta muerte y crímenes de odio. No es eso un pecado, no es eso un crimen, es lo que Dios planeó, que sus hijos lloren así. Al mirar el espejo te justificas, estás feliz con lo que ves por dentro y por fuera. Si la respuesta es sí, bendecido serás, pues para algunos el espejo no tiene sentido. Hermanos y hermanas, no pueden ver, nacimos para amarlos, para liberarlos, para que vean que afortunados son de estar enteros y completos. Por fuera y por dentro, solo pedimos que nos dejen ser y que cuenten las bendiciones que tienen. Oigan el llanto, sientan el dolor. Queremos ser completos sin tener temor. Deseamos desesperadamente ser tan solo